After what I think was actually quite a brave attempt to get to grips with Gen Z feminism last time, this time arguably the challenge is even greater, because we've got to try and make a book about economic history and changing world orders interesting. This anyway is How Countries Go Broke by Ray Dalio, written in 2025, so I'm current again. I always pick his up because I work in finance, and he is an economic historian, among other things, as being a hedge fund manager. Really interesting. And actually, he's one of the few who's made it into the very elite Market Wizards, I nearly fell off my chair, Market Wizards books. So it's a man who's absolutely put his money where his mouth is and knows what he's talking about. And he's probably actually a leading authority in the world on economic history. Clearly just particularly passionate about it. I don't think it's, to some extent, I think it's driven his investment management. But I think certainly these days, at least, it just seems to be more something that he's particularly interested in. The main problem with this book is that it even disclaims within it that quite a lot of the sections are a little bit dry, for want of a better word. So if you don't work in finance, this might not be a cover-to-cover type thing, but Ray does direct you to which bits you can pay attention to and which bits you can just ignore as being a bit technical. But as usual, all I'm trying to capture here is the big ideas, because that's the interesting bit for me. And you can't read enough books and get all the little bits, so you've got to just get higher level understanding of the big ideas, I guess. The nub of the idea here is that, as it talks about, there are cycles. It's a big cycle, but within the big cycle there are little cycles. So 2008 being the global financial crisis, up to now is one little one, and the big one goes back to 1945 at the end of the Second World War. It's then about what happens at the end of these big cycles, and I suppose the 1945 thing sort of foreshadows what what Ray is expecting to see here, in that 1945 marked the end of the British Empire and the winding up of our global aspiration. I say, I was not there, it was not me, it's not my fault. It was the end of that, Britain being a superpower and America coming and taking over. So it sort of implies that at the end of the next big cycle, that's where America potentially falls off its perch. It's worth mentioning here that if you're looking for how Ray Dalio manages a hedge fund in order to deal with all these problems, it's not in this book. In fact, it's not even in that book either. Some ideas are, but there's nothing that's going to help you build yourself a hedge fund. But it does help to identify what the problem is that's coming, to some extent, or at least part of it. I suppose that's the first part of dealing with any problem, isn't it? To actually define what that problem is. So I guess that's key in what he's looking at here. As a very short summary of what he's actually flagging, it's basically that there's some striking parallels between the world now and the world just prior to the First World War, in terms of that led on to that cycle ending and moving into this one, and now we're looking at a similar sort of echo of stuff happening just before World War One. Interesting, he doesn't predict a war. I don't know if that's because he doesn't actually think this would lead to one, or if you don't go around predicting wars, because that's a bit of a difficult thing, isn't it? But he largely characterises the period before the First World War being high debt, inefficient governments and fractured global relationships. So you can definitely see an echo between what was then and what's now. And it's interesting to see when he pulls that out, like, okay, yeah, you can sort of see how that's going. He also talks about one of the other problems is the rise of autocracy that results from this, and Hitler being the example obvious one of in the 1930s, basically coming to power off the back of some very dissatisfied people in Germany who, well, they started the First World War, but, how it was dealt with afterwards. I mean, I think it's an interesting argument. The Second World War was basically the same war as the First World War, and because the end of the First World War made it inevitable there would be a second one to some extent, perhaps in the real world. But we do have a kind of an odd world order, don't we? Have Russia doing lots of things with a guy who's a little autocratic, China a little bit autocratic, and even in America we've got President Trump, who's, I guess he's not autocratic, but he's at least trying to be, and there's a lot of people are still supporting him in that. And then in the UK we've got this problem of creeping socialism, which I'm not blaming the Labour government for. I think that's been something that's creeping on for quite a long time, but we do seem to be heading in that direction. So yeah, you can definitely see some parallels between now and 100 and however many years ago. Given the book is largely about debt, he understandably likens a lot of the problems as tracing back to the West coming off the gold standard back in 1971. And it seems logically obvious that if you put politicians in the position where they can print money, I mean, granted there's central bank independence to some extent, but if you put people in a position where they can print money to get out of trouble, and they're just going to do that. So it seemed inevitable as soon as you come off the gold standard, that problem is just going to creep up and up and up. And sure, we're getting to the point now where it's, it could come back from the brink, and Ray walks through a scenario how that could be done. It doesn't seem anyone's trying to do that, and cutting spending doesn't seem to be going well. But of course, then added to all the problems of socialism rising and autocracy and upset people and fractured global relationships, we also have this spiralling debt problem. So people are in less of a position to be able to do stuff about it, and it's just compounding the problem. Interestingly, though, he makes a great point, which is one I'm always making to my clients. So it's wonderful to hear someone like Ray Dalio say it. But it's this idea that people get really jittery about headlines. So when my clients want to invest money, a lot of what they'll talk about is, oh, the world is this and the world is that. And Ray Dalio has a brilliant angle on it because he's much older than me. But he talks about how the Cuban Missile Crisis and the assassination of JFK, both events, you think back, it's bizarre. I mean, imagine they were happening now. The Cuban Missile Crisis, you're thinking that there are people still haunted by that today. It was so serious, wasn't it? I mean, it's clearly not a nice time. And, in hindsight, it looks fairly obvious that there was no way they were actually going to go to war with it. Khrushchev just needed to back off and settle down, and America needed to let him. But at the time, there's no way it would have looked like that. And so it would be understandable that people would expect to see, the stock market would have been upset at the time, and for people to have been really worried about that, and I don't want to do anything. And the same with JFK. But Ray Dalio talks about he being extraordinarily surprised at the time, for he was a young man at that point, just how quickly the market shrugged it off, just didn't really care. And it all comes back to the point that I'm always going to my clients. It's like, it doesn't matter about headlines, and it will create volatility in the short term, but you should be investing for long term, or you shouldn't be doing it at all. And therefore, it's underlying profitability of the companies you own shares in that matters. And it's wonderful to have Ray backing that up as well. So I can quote him at my clients as well. Not that anyone's heard of him much, I don't think, outside of finance. It's not like Warren Buffett. But certainly, I mean, he's as worth listening to as Warren Buffett, certainly. Another interesting one that he and I agree, which is, again, wonderful, so I'm going to pull that in and I can quote him when I'm talking about this with clients, is artificial intelligence. He's quite a big fan of this, and he is invested in it, but he does make the point that it's not about how much it changes the world, it's about how do you make money from doing it. And this is what I'm talking to a lot of my clients about. It's, I want to buy into AI and all the rest of it. It's like, okay, there's some really high valuations going on at the minute. It's like, how does that pan out? What does 10 years down the road look like? And I don't think people have necessarily thought about that. They just think AI is going to change the world. It's like, yeah, so did cars and so did the internet. But, we heard of the dot-com bubble burst. And as Warren Buffett said, the way to make money on the invention of the car was not to buy shares in cars. It was to short horses. So that's a difficult one in that Ray is actually involved in that. But then he has a hedge fund, so he can express his views in a very complex manner that the rest of us can't do. So for the rest of us, if anyone were to make any really significant, serious money off of AI, it would basically have to be by accident, by definition. There's just no way you can know. I'm sure there's someone who would hear that and say, oh, I've made tons of NVIDIA and all the rest of it. It's like, yeah, if you've banked the money and you're out, you're no longer exposed to it, then you can say, yes, you've done it. But otherwise, if you're still in it until the AI bubble bursts, which presumably it's got to at some point, I mean, the maths doesn't support these valuations going up because they have to be matched with profits in the future. And how is AI going to make profits when it's all been given away and the Chinese have managed to do something for a fraction of the cost? And large language models seem to be hitting the limits and what they can achieve. And until then, you're not out. So you can say you've made all the money you like in the world up to now, but you've still got that risk on the table until this is over. That's about all I can summarise on it, because the rest is pretty heavy detail. And it's slightly annoying. He doesn't tell you what he thinks anyone should do about it. But I have a fairly standard response for all of Ray's stuff, actually, in terms of, because I've been reading his stuff for many years now, and it's a lot of doom and gloom. I don't mean to make him sound like evil. He's not like that, and clearly he's not worried about this stuff in the sense of it's going to ruin his life. It seems more he's just interested in it. But My feeling on all his stuff is always you get to a little bit of something close to, so what? And I'll eat those words, obviously, if we end up in a third world war as the last one ended up in the First and Second World War. But on the assumption that's unlikely, hopefully, yeah, we have a big changing world order and all the rest of it. In the last changing world order, my country fell from grace and became, well, fairly insignificant, not completely insignificant. I guess we punch above our weight in terms of size, but things aren't going particularly great. But at the same time, I live here and, you know, despite the headlines saying how terrible everything is, it's kind of fine. And I obviously acknowledge that I live in a nice little bubble part of it, off in a quiet corner. And, you know, one of the key things for dealing with any sort of global problems is having enough money to be able to absorb problems and all the rest of it. So it's easy to say when you're in a comfortable position of not being broke. But that is just about all you can actually do, isn't it? I mean, it's not like for normal folk, we can't do anything about the changing world order and cut government spending and all the rest of it. We can't reliably predict when this is going to happen. It could be this year, it could be in 20 years. There's just no way of knowing. So you can't shove cash under the mattress just in case, because you might ruin your life. We don't know what form the problems will take. Ultimately, you can see a potential catalyst, but you can't predict that accurately. And we don't know what the outcome will be. So you're sort of stuffed. And you know, it's almost like you're a problem that you can't push back against it because there's nothing there. And you've almost got to wait for something to actually be in your face and then you can give it a shove. So from my point of view, it seems to me that all you can really do is protect yourself as best you can for any general situation, which is basically keep your debt as low as you can. Make sure you've got some suitable savings built up to deal with problems and they're suitably invested in whatever. Not going into that here. And make sure you have a valuable skill that you keep up to date so it remains valuable over time. When the sky falls, you'll know what you're fighting against, but until it does, at least that way you're prepared for as broad a range of things as you can. I mean, if an asteroid crashes into the Earth, there's nothing you can do anyway, is there? But on the basis, some sort of debt seems like a very high potential to cause some problems, and global relationships seems to be suitable for causing some problems. And then how do those manifest themselves and how do you deal with those? Basically, debt low, savings, and a valuable skill. That's the best you can do to deal with anything like that. That's certainly what I take from it anyway, and how I approach it all. And then, yes, I'm just happy to leave Ray to worry about it, albeit saying I don't think he's worried from a doom-mongering Eeyore sort of perspective. But yeah, so if you're into macroeconomics and economic history, then really interesting. And, you know, not that massive compared to some of the other ones up there. They're humongous. But yes, it's it's not much fun.